Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series, The Life and Teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov. And specifically, we're continuing looking into the Sefer Keter Shem Tov, probably the most important compilation of actual teachings from the Ba'al Shem Tov is explanations of the Torah. So we started last week, and we are continuing. For those who have the book, we are on the 11th Yud Aleph. That's where we're going to start. And I personally love this one. When we started learning this, I made a comment that the two things that we'll see consistently through the Keter Shem Tov is the Ba'al Shem Tov's innovative mind and his giving over of Kabbalah, but in a more accessible manner. The Ba'al Shem Tov is known for reaching out to the so-called simple Jew, telling stories, simplifying the Torah, encouraging people, no matter how much they knew, how much they could learn, that their avoda, their service of God is very acceptable. It's equal to everyone else. So he encouraged everyone. The teachings in Keter Shem Tov are his Torah insights that he's more sharing with his core group of students who then went out and spread the Chassidic movement in every direction. So these are his more deep insights, not necessarily shared with everyone. And his innovative way of looking at a text, looking at the world, and his use of Kabbalistic terminology and symbols is so prevalent. That's what we're going to see in the first one here. So it begins, this person is basing it on another Torah, where the Ba'al Shem Tov discusses the idea of the creation of the world, and especially the idea of yesh me'ayin, that God created the world something from nothing, which of course is a paradoxical statement, because in our world we are used to, or our experience of the world is yesh me'yesh, something from something. To say that something comes from nothing is almost oxymoronic. How can that be? Nonetheless, our tradition is that God created the world yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. There was nothing there. There was no time. There was no space. Nothing other than the infinite light of God. So in the level of creation, there was nothing there, as it were. So it begins b'Sefer Eitz Chaim. So in the book Eitz Chaim, this is the beginning of what's called Kitvei Ha'ari, the teachings of the Arizal, as compiled by Rabbi Chaim Vital. K'she'ala b'rtzono ha'pashut livro et ha'olam. So that's how the Eitz Chaim begins. When it rose up in God's simple will to create the world. So the Ba'al Shem Tov taught, Baraya muchrachat lezeh me'adam ha'machadesh b'Torah. In other words, how can we even understand a concept that will be given over in the Eitz Chaim of something from nothing? So the Ba'al Shem Tov says, well, let's take an example from our own experience. So he says, what is this example? Me'adam ha'machadesh b'Torah. a person who says an innovative idea in the Torah, something that perhaps has never been said before. And this is perfect proof that our oral Torah is alive and well, because even after thousands of years, it's very possible, in fact, it happens all the time, that someone comes up with an absolute new insight into the Torah. So the Ba'al Shem says, Shechidesh yesh mi'ayin. He said, this is an example of creating something from nothing. B'techila lo chidesh, v'achshav ha'sechel molid v'nitchadesh davar yesh me'ayin. At first, there was no new thought, and then the person somehow comes up with this new idea in his mind, and what is born is something new, something from nothing. In other words, there was never an insight like this, and a person has this flash of this insight. So he says that's an example of something from nothing. As we said, our experience of the world is virtually only something from something. A lot of times we're told that the closest thing that we can really imagine of something from nothing is the birth of a child. But even there, it's a something. There is a sperm and an egg. It's a something. It's not coming from nowhere. But here he says, like the perfect example is a new Torah thought, something from nothing. Now, look what he does with this. Ba'al Shem Tov Zal. Sheyesh b'sechel adam eser sfirot. Because there, there is in a person's intellect 10 sfirot. Not only are there 10 sfirot through which God creates the world, but within each person on a psychological, emotional, intellectual level, the sfirot are the dynamic actors. So within the intellect, there are 10 sfirot. Ki Abba ve'ima hem hamolidim devar shenitchadesh b'Torah. Nikra Abba ve'ima. So here, what he says is that here he says, Ki Abba ve'ima. Abba and Ima is father and mother. This is a term used for chachma and bina, wisdom and understanding. So he says, he's going to use an example now of how a new idea is born, but it goes through all 10 sfirot. So he says like this. So it begins with Abba and Ima, Chachma and Bina, that they give birth to a new idea in Torah. And because they're called Abba and Ima, they're the ones who are giving birth to this idea. B'techila nikra chesed, kishenit chadesh hadavar, shemitpashet la'ayin tachlit, shehu bechinat chesed kenoda. So he says, Ab and Ima, Chachma and Bina, give birth to a new idea. What then happens to that idea? He says that idea is connected to chesed. That is the first of the 7 lower sfirot. Why is it connected to chesed? Because what a great chesed that God has endowed the human mind with the opportunity and the ability to come up with new insight, especially new insight that no one has ever said before. This is a great chesed from God. And it's also connected to this idea of giving birth from nothing. This is the great chesed of God that he created the world in the first place. There was nothing. And so once the nothing becomes a something, that is, it's seeping with chesed. And we know that the 7 days of creation parallel the 7 sfirot. And the 7 sfirot are the 7 days of creation. The first day of creation is chesed. So that's where the chiddush comes. Yesh ma'ayin is first revealed in chesed. Then he says, v'achar kach tzorich b'china gevura. But after that, we need the aspect of gevura, the next of the sfirot. Why? Sodat tzimtzum. The gevura is called the secret of contraction. It's power. It's judgment, but it's this power of contraction, of strength, of power. But so what does this have to do with a new idea? So he says, Sheyachol litfos la'omro mipnei acharim. Okay, a new insight is born, and this is a great chesed, but now the person wants or needs to share this with other people. Well, that entails the idea of contraction, because our thoughts sometimes are all over the place, but now I have to give it over to another person. I have to contract this new idea into a form that people will understand. So that's how it goes from chesed to gevura. And everything goes according to the middle column of the sfirot. So we have chesed and we have gevura. And now the middle column is Tiferet. And that is taking these two elements, the expanded consciousness that brought the new idea into reality in the first place, and the ability to contract that into a form that people will understand. And that contracting is coming through Tiferet. As he says, everything will come through the middle column of being able to unify the thought with the ability to give it over. And that is Tiferet. Ve'achar kach tzorich ha'emunah k'mo shekatuv b'shas in the tractate of Makot, ba Chabakuk ba'amidan al achat b'tzadik be'emunotah yichya b'chinat ha'emunah hem trei samchei kashut netzach pahod. Okay, I'll go back and translate. So now that it's going to the middle column, so the Ba'al Shem says afterwards, it needs an aspect of faith. In other words, that a person has in other words, he's now contracted the idea that he's able to give it over to others, but he has to have a certain self-confidence, a certain belief in his ability to give it over. It might still be in the mind. He's contracted it in his mind that, okay, now I can give it over, but now he needs the emunah and bitachon. And here, the Ba'al Shem Tov brings from Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, Bamidan al-Achat, he was able to take all the principles of the Torah and condense it into one idea. And this idea is that it begins with David HaMelech in one of the Psalms. I don't have it in front of me, where David HaMelech took all of the qualities that we need to be a good person in this world, to serve God, and he distilled it to 11 principles. And then Yeshayahu, Isaiah, came and got it down to 6 principles on which a person can base their whole service of God. And then it was distilled by Micha into 3. And here the Ba'al Shem Tov says, and then Habakkuk came and he stood the whole Torah on one principle, and that is v'tzadik be'emunato yechiyah. A tzaddik, a righteous person, in his faith will live. In other words, faith becomes the pillar on which the whole Torah rests. But then the Ba'al Shem Tov explains that this pillar really it's really 2 pillars, and that's Netzach and Hod. So here, before we finish the lessons, we've gone from Chachma and Bina to Chesed, Gevura, and then Tiferet, and now to Netzach and Hod. The Ba'al Shem Tov continues, V'achar kach hatanug sheyesh lo b'ma shechidesh nikra yesod, shehu ever a tanug. So then the Ba'al Shem Tov says the next sphera is Yesod. Yesod, as the Ba'al Shem Tov says, is connected to pleasure, ta'anug. And this is always connected to the sphere of Yesod, because Yesod is connected to sexuality, and sexuality is, in a certain way, the epitome in a physical sense of pleasure in this world. So now it's been drawn down. In other words, now the person, he has this new idea, and now he's condensed it in a way that it could be understood. He's able to bring it into Tiferet, where it will be balanced the way that he gives it over. And then he has to have the confidence and the faith that this is a worthy idea to give over. And then he experiences a certain level of pleasure from this new idea. And then finally, the last sphere is Malchut. And the Ba'al Shem Tov says, V'nitkale al yedei dibor, shehu Malchut. And then finally, the person is able to express it in the world to other people. And that's what's called Malchut. And Malchut is always connected to speech. Malchut pe karinenla. Malchut is always connected to speech. So here we've seen really an absolute amazing teaching from the Ba'al Shem Tov, where he takes the 10 sfirot and he explains how a new idea is filtered from the very highest intellect, Chachma and Bina, father and mother, and how it filters in a practical sense into the world until a person could actually give it over to others. So here we see the Ba'al Shem has not only an intimate understanding of the Sfirot, but he's able to take an idea like getting a new idea in the Torah and explaining it according to the Sfirot. So I'll mention that when we're learning the Keter Shem Tov, we have to understand that each one of these Torahs had a profound effect on Jewish thought. And of course, his students then shared these ideas, spread these ideas. And what may come in one short Torah from the Ba'al Shem Tov has incredible influence throughout the generations. So I'm mentioning that specifically with this Torah because one of the greatest innovations of Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg is he uses the same model in hundreds, at this point probably thousands of examples, where he takes ideas, words, names, concepts, every aspect of reality, and explains it. This is like a flow chart. And he explains it, how it manifests through the hierarchy of the Sfirot. And in all of Rav Ginsburg's books, there are these models. And here, that's why this particular Torah is talking about one idea. The idea of taking a thought which parallels a creation from yesh, from ayin, something from nothing, and with I'll call it a flow chart, a model, explains how to use and understand the Sfirot as living entities that are part of every point of reality. So that's why this particular Torah was highly influential. Okay, going on to the next one. We're not doing every single one. I've chosen certain ones that I feel are the best to give over. This one is Tet Zayin, number 16, Tet Zayin. This is a short one. So this is somewhat connected to what we just learned. So the Ba'al Shem Tov taught from the verse, Ki mibisari echazeh. This is coming from Job, the 19th chapter, the 26th verse. Ki mibisari echazeh elokah. From my flesh, I envision God. Now, the reason I chose this, we're going to see what the Ba'al Shem Tov says, but first I want to explain the importance of this verse from Job. From my flesh, I will envision God. So it's explained in Kabbalah that the word flesh, mibisari, this was the way the Zohar used the symbolism of the human body as a way to explain the Sfirot. In other words, in the Zohar, the sphere of Chesed is always called the right arm, and Gevurah is called the left arm, and Tiferet is called the heart, and Netzach and Hod are called the two legs. Yesod is the sexual organ, and Malchut is the mouth. And so in the Zohar, in many cases, the actual names of the Sfirah are not named. Instead, these symbolic body parts are used. And it's connected to this verse, that from my flesh, I will envision God. In other words, by our being able to take the Sfirot and correspond them, to parallel them to the human body, so then the human body becomes a symbolic way of understanding the Sfirot. Now, this was true in Kabbalah for many, many, many hundreds of years. The Ba'al Shem Tov took the same verse and he wanted to explain it more in a psychological way. That the word bisari, from my flesh, means more from my midot, from human characteristics, human attributes. So chesed, instead of being referred to as the right arm, again, it's not a contradiction whatsoever. It's just a different language to explain the same thing. But one of the great contributions of the Ba'al Shem Tov was he took Kabbalah and made it more human accessible, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually accessible to not just the outer, as it were, the outer body parts, but the inner dynamics of a human being. So that's just the importance of this verse that this Torah is based on. So he continues, Kamo b'zivug gashmi eino molid ki'im ha-mishamesh be'ever chai b'cheshech b'simcha. So he says like this. He says, just like a physical union, a marital intimate union, will only give birth to an actual child is if the act is accomplished through great desire and joy. Kach b'zivug haruchani. He says the same thing with a spiritual union. Hu adibur b'Torah b'tefillah kishehu be'ever chai b'simcha b'tanug as hu molid. So here the zivug is, and we learned this many times when we went through Amuda Tefillah, when we learned the Ba'al Shem Tov's teaching about tefillah, that we have to take the words of the Torah and prayer and invest them with deep kavanah. That's what the yichud is. Because if you just say the words without any kavanah, without any intent, then they are not going to give birth to new insight, to spiritual experience. That's what the Ba'al Shem Tov is saying here. Just like a physical union, we're talking about in an ideal sense, will only give birth to not only a child, but will give birth to love. In other words, let's say, God forbid, but rape or forced sex does not give birth to love. It's just the opposite. So here, the Ba'al Shem is saying, just like physical union needs pure spiritual desire and joy, so too that when we're speaking the words of Torah and tefillah, if there's going to be a union between us and the words and us and God, that's how we get to a union to God. When the words become invested with kavanah, then a union can occur and give birth. So if we take this and apply it to the first Torah that we learned, we will ask, well, how did Chachma and Bina, father and mother, come up with this new idea that had never been thought of before in the first place? So here we can apply this. If a person is learning Torah, if a person is involved, doesn't have to be sitting with a book, but is thinking about Torah, thinking about God, is in the midst of meditation or prayer or any thought that is holy. So if it's done in a way full of pure spiritual desire to be unified with God and enjoy, then it will give birth. And that's where the birth of Abba and Ima happened in Chachma and Bina. It doesn't happen just by happenstance. There have to be the right spiritual ingredients to allow a new thought to come into the world. So that is our second insight tonight. The next one we're going to do is Chaf Aleph. Now, if you remember last week, we learned this idea and we discussed it at great length, is the Ba'al Shem Tov said every word has two, at least two, sometimes opposite meanings. There's no word that only has one connotation, one meaning. And so he said every word can have a negative and a positive meaning. And he brought the verse, Zeh le'umat zeh asa Elokim. This against this God has made. In other words, this is a dualistic world on the outside. On the inside, it's all unified. It's all one. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Everything is one. But the Torah begins with a big bet, which is two. This is a very bipolar, opposite, dualistic kind of world. So that's what the Ba'al Shem taught. And then he further taught that these two opposites is Zachar v'Nekeva, male and female. And we discussed at length that here we're not talking about male and female bodies. We're talking about masculine and feminine energies that appear in every level of creation. And this is one of the greatest innovations of the Zohar that explain everything in the world according to these two energies of masculine and feminine. So let's see what the Ba'al Shem Tov says here. So he begins, Hinei yesh b'toch ha'teva b'chiyut shnayim zachar v'nekeva. So that's basically what we just said, that there is in each word a double life force of masculine and feminine. V'kativ b'makom acher b'shem the Ba'al Shem Tov biur pasuk le'et ziknato shel Shlomo Melech. This is the Torah we learned before, that his wives influenced his heart. And he says, Ki b'chol teva yesh bet perushim. In every word there are two explanations. Echad, now he says something different here. He says, Echad b'rachamim b'chinat zachar. There is an aspect of compassion. This is the masculine. Bet b'chinat din anikra nekeva, and the aspect of judgment, which is the feminine. B'zeh amar nashav hitu et livavo, and that's what it means that King Solomon's wives influenced his heart. Now that's like a review of what we learned last week. Now he's going to say something else. Shnayim ish ve'ishto. So this is talking about when Noach took two animals, male and female. Ba'u ela teva. He come into the ark. Ki yesh bei perushim b'chol teva. So what does it mean? He on a very deep, symbolic, mystical level, that Noah took two animals, a male and a female, into the ark. So he says that's what we've been explaining, that every word, because remember the word ark, teva, means a word. And this is like a proof that the word teva has two different meanings. One is an ark, a physical ark that saved Noah and his family and all the animals. But a teva also simply means a word. So here, when it says that he brought male and female into the ark, means that every word has these two aspects. Ki yesh beit perushim b'chol teva, echad b'chinat zachar, rachamim, bet b'chinat nekeva din. So that we translated already. But tzadikim ma'avchim midin lemidat harachamim, midat din, lemidat harachamim. So now you have rachamim and you have din, you have compassion and you have judgment. So he ends by saying a righteous person has the power to turn judgment into compassion. That is the great spiritual level of a tzaddik, is they can take a situation full of judgment and find a way to turn it around into rachamim. And we're told that every person has a point of righteousness. All your people are righteous. Then each one of us also has the ability to take call it a negative circumstance or situation and find a way to turn it into something positive, something full of compassion. So here again, we see this basic principle from the Ba'al Shem Tov, he's like opening up our understanding of the Torah, that we shouldn't be reading the Torah one-dimensionally. That we read it and we assign meaning to each word. But what he's trying to point out is, but that's only on one level. Every word, every verse in the Torah, every story, every circumstance in life is going to have more than just one dimension to it, one explanation. And we have to train ourselves to see deeper aspects of every circumstance of life. Okay, the next one is Chaf Daled. Okay, so this seems fairly simple, but I'm bringing it for a specific idea. So it says from the Ba'al Shem Tov, B'Shem Rav Sadia Gaon. The Ba'al Shem Tov here is quoting Sadia Gaon. Ki ikar b'riyat Adam ba'olam hazeh. The main reason, or the main purpose of the creation of a human being in this world, l'shaber midot ra'ot, that a person will have the opportunity to break, literally break, bad characteristics. Ha-tiviot shalot, his natural characteristics. Ubezeh ma'aleh madriga hanikra tivacha. But from there, a person can rise up to a level that's called your nature. Ba'olam ha'elyon, in higher worlds, meaning higher levels of consciousness. Once we break our more negative inbred characteristics, then we can rise to actually a more true natural nature within each person. Shenikra olam loshana elem v'nistar. That the word olam for world also means to be hidden. Now here's a great paradox. Olam is like the world out there. What we see, what we experience, what we taste and hear and touch. And yet the same word olam means to be hidden. So this is applied to God. As the Rambam says, if you want to know about God, look at the world around you. Understand the world. Learn about the world. And the more you learn about the world, the more you'll understand about God, who's the creator. But at the same time, as we know, God is very hidden in this world. He's here, and we can perceive God's presence, and at the same time, he's totally hidden. So here he's saying that when a person breaks their inbred, what's called their first nature, and they're able to rectify, clarify, refine, not really squelch or destroy their innate nature, but just to improve it, to refine it, then that becomes what was hidden before, then becomes a person's natural nature, what's called second nature. And that, I remember Nahum shared with us that Rav Ginsburg teaches that this term, second nature, Teva Sheni equals 441, equals the word emet, truth. And so even though our initial, our Teva Rishon, our inbred characteristics are who we are, but that's what the Ba'al Shem Tov is pointing out from Sadia Gaon, that every person should not just stick with their inbred characteristics, but they should elevate them, refine them. And sometimes we have to break them in order to reveal a more hidden set of characteristics that are actually even more inbred. They're just hidden over. That's why at the end, the Ba'al Shem Tov says that when we can refine our first nature, then we rise to a higher level. And he says that Olam is Lashon He'elam B'nistar, but it can be revealed. Just like God is hidden from us a good part of the time, but through meditation, introspection, contemplation, doing mitzvot, learning Torah, davening, doing good deeds, we can have experiences and realizations of God that can be very clear. So one of the hidden secrets of this is that according to Chassidic tradition, one of the parts of the Ba'al Shem Tov, one of the reincarnated aspects of the soul of the Ba'al Shem Tov was from Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon was one of the greatest sages in Babylonia, when Babylonia was the center of Jewish life, more than Israel, because Israel had been exiled, and there are only literally handfuls of Jews that were left in the land. It was the Babylonian community that produced the Talmud, and Sadia Gaon was one of the greatest of the leaders of this community and of the sages of that period. And it's considered that he's one of the elements in the soul of the Ba'al Shem Tov. So here I wanted to bring this Torah because here he's quoting Rabbi Sadia Gaon. And the idea is very, very, very important. Very important. So I'll tell a quick joke about this. There was a man who would go to a bar, and he would get pretty drunk every night, and he would always take his glass and throw it against the wall and break it. The bar owner was not so happy about this. It caused all kinds of confusion, and but this guy bought a lot of drinks, so he he was trying to work this out. But finally it got to him, and he said, "You cannot come here anymore. You can't do this anymore. Go to a psychologist, go to get treatment. And when you do, you come back and I'll happily have you. So the man didn't come back for like 4 months. And then he comes back and he orders drinks, he drinks. At the end, he takes his glass, smashes it against the wall. And the bartender said, I thought you went to therapy. Didn't you go to therapy? He said, yeah, I did go to therapy. And I learned not to be guilty about throwing my glass against the wall. That's what I learned. So this is a kind of psychology, and it's very real out there. Very real out there. Like if you have certain feelings or certain tendencies, don't fight against it. Don't try to fix it. If that's you, and get into it. So that's what this man learned. There was no impetus to change. But what he learned psychologically is if that's who I am and what I do, not to feel guilty about it. That's the opposite of what we're learning here. The exact opposite is that each and every one of us knows very well certain things that we need to fix or refine or improve. And the Ba'al Shem Tov is quoting the Tzaddik On that's what we're doing in this world. That will bring us to a true Teva Sheni, which is Emet, our real selves. Okay, in this one, this is Chaf Vav 26, Chaf Vav. So here, the Ba'al Shem Tov brings one of the ideas that we've quoted many, many times, but this is the source. This is the source, not the only source, but this is where he talks about it. So it says like this, Me'achar she'ashechina kolelet kol ha'olamot, Dom Sameach Chaya Medaber. He says, since the Shekhinah includes all of the worlds, the inanimate, the domem, the vegetable, the tzomeach, the animal, the chaya, and the human, the medaber. The kol nivraim tovim v'ra'im, and the Shekhinah, which is God's all-encompassing presence, encompasses all of the worlds, including good and not so good. Like it says in Yeshayahu, Yotzer Or u'varei choshech, Oseh Shalom u'varei Torah. That God forms light and creates darkness. He makes peace and creates evil. So I should say the possibility of evil, because we say very clearly that no evil comes from God. But God does create the possibility of evil. It's always our choice. But the Shekhinah encompasses all of this. Vayichud amiti hu Shekhinah, and the idea of unification is what the Shekhinah is about, because the Shekhinah includes all worlds and all positive and negative. And then he says, and how is it that the Shekhinah can include two opposites and hold them together? Now, this is one of the most important concepts in Kabbalah. this idea that God is what's called nosei hafachim. He holds opposites. What appear to us as opposites, like good and evil, positive and negative, for God, God holds them both and are ultimately unified. And they're not opposites from God's point of view. But still, it's paradoxical, the nature of God who holds opposites. Tov v'ra, shehem beit hafachim. God is holding good and evil, two opposites. V'hu yichud, and that is actually the essence of unification, is when you can take two opposites and unify them. Aval be'emet ati shafir ki hara hu kisei lahatov. This is the concept that we brought many times. He says, but in truth, evil is the chair or the platform for good. Kamo paro hikriv. So what example does he bring? This is a deep concept that evil is the carrier, is the platform for good, meaning that from evil will come good. So the example he brings is uparo hikriv. This is taken when we leave Egypt, and 3 days later, Pharaoh is informed that Israel is not coming back. If you remember, originally Moshe said, we want to go for 3 days in the desert and serve our God. And he didn't say we're coming back or we're not coming back. We want to go for 3 days and serve our God. Obviously, the idea was to leave Egypt forever. But Pharaoh didn't understand. So they came and said, they're leaving. They're not coming back. So Pharaoh takes his whole army and he chases after Israel. And that's where they get trapped by the Reed Sea and the whole miracle occurs. But in the text, it says, and Pharaoh drew close. But the words for Pharaoh drew close is Ufaro hikriv, which means literally, and Pharaoh brought close. Not that he came close, but he caused closeness to happen. So it's explained that because of this evil intent of Pharaoh, they wanted to kill all of Israel who were escaping, or at least bring them back to be slaves again. But the result is it created a miracle, and it brought Israel closer to God. The second example that's always used is Haman and the story of Purim. And so if you remember the story, when Haman tells Achashverosh his plan, that he wants permission to be able to kill all the Jews, and he will add 10,000 pieces of gold or silver to King Achashverosh's treasury. So it says in the text that the way that Achashverosh acquiesced to this request is he took off his ring and he put it on Haman. And so it says in the Gemara that Achashverosh taking off his ring and putting it on Haman did more to cause the Jewish people to do tshuva than anything in the world could have done at that point. In other words, it looked like this was the worst action in the world. He was giving permission to Haman. And yet that action is what caused Israel to do tshuva, which created the possibility of a miracle occurring and the whole story being nafochu, turning around. So that's what the Ba'al Shem Tov is saying here. Kisei Ra kisei l'tov, that somehow everything evil in the world can be, and in a sense will be, turned into good. So he continues, and he gives another example. He says, "Oh, al yedei shero'eh ma'aseh rashayim yesh lo hana'ah shehu tzadik v'yesh lo hana'ah v'ta'anug al yedei hara." So this is a little bit of an interesting example he brings here. Another example of how can evil be a platform for good that will follow. It says that a righteous person can look at an evil person and say, Baruch Hashem, I'm not like that. Baruch Hashem, I haven't fallen that low. He said, and that brings pleasure to a person, and that enforces a person's desire to be good. When they see an evil person, or not even an evil person, they see someone doing something very negative, and a person can have even rachmanas. Let's say a person sees a homeless person who's a drug addict. Doesn't mean that they're evil, but a righteous person could look at them and say, Baruch Hashem, thank you Hashem that I have not ended up like this. He said that's another type of example of how evil can be a platform for good. And then he says, Al Yedei Hara, B'kimat she'al Yedei Zeh yesh l'ra gam kein aliyah. Rak she'oleh misham yitpardu kol polei oven. V'chein machshava ra'ah hu kisei al derech hanal. So he says that even this consciousness of a righteous person saying, Baruch Hashem, I didn't end up like this, that by this person separating themselves from this kind of evil or behavior or negativity, that it can awaken a thought process that could influence the negative energy in the world not to be like that. Not to be like that. And then he ends by saying, V'chein machshava ra'ah hu kisei al derech hanal. And that also sometimes we get a negative thought. And how can this be a platform for good? So this is very understandable. Let's say a person has a very negative idea, but they immediately think to themselves, "Oh, how could I have thought that? That's so negative. That's not really me. That's like my Yetzer Hara, like trying to speak through me. But that's not the real me." And through that, we separate from this kind of negative thinking, and it helps correct ourselves, helps refine ourselves. That this kind of thought, this is not me. It's coming from the Yetzer Hara, or it's coming from a part of me that needs to be fixed. So I'm going to divorce myself from this thought. I'm going to separate myself from the thought, and that brings an elevation of soul. So here, the Ba'al Shem Tov brings a number of different examples. Each one is somewhat different of how evil can be turned into good, how it can become a incentive or an impetus towards good. We were using the word kisei, which literally means a chair for good, but it also means an incentive and an impetus, a dynamic to push me towards good. And I think that is all we have time for tonight. So here, just to review, we went through some really, really important, each one of these is kind of classic. Each one of these becomes such an important part of what became Chassidic thought. So the first one, as we saw, this beautiful flow chart of the way the Ba'al Shem Tov used the Sfirot to explain how a new thought starts in the intellect and then all the different stages it goes to until a person can actually express it in the world. So this was the way the Ba'al Shem Tov used Kabbalah, but in a very, very practical example. And then we learned this idea of, again, the idea of masculine and feminine energy in the world, and the ideas of mercy, compassion, and judgment. And then we learned this idea of fixing our innate characteristics. And finally, this idea of how we can take even evil or negativity and turn it into good. May we all be blessed to take these teachings and really integrate them and to improve ourselves and reveal our more hidden, inner, but true nature.